870,000 people in East Prussia fled their homes in August 1914 alone, and just put everything they could carry on the back of a car or on a bicycle or on their backs and fled. We think about the war in terms of the men who did the fighting, the ones who carried rifles, lived in trenches and died on the battlefield. But as you're about to see, just because you didn't do these things didn't mean that the war was any less real to you. We're going to take a look at just a few of the millions of men, women and children who experienced the First World War a different way. First of all, women were mobilised on a scale never seen before in terms of the First World War. They took on more roles in larger numbers than they had at any time in any war in history. Nursing is a traditional one. We always think of female nurses in wartime, and it was no different in the First World War. There's more distant caregiving as well. So across Europe, wealthy women put their houses at the disposal of the war effort. So you saw this in Mayfair in London, where all of these huge mansions with many bedrooms were put aside as not necessarily hospitals because they didn't have the facilities, but as convalescent homes. So when a soldier was done recovering in terms of medically, but needed more time to get his strength back, they would go and stay in one of these houses. So Princess Beatrice, Queen Victoria's youngest daughter, she has one of these houses, and this is something that she does. You also see it in Warsaw as well. So Polish women, specifically like women from the intelligentsia, came forward in huge numbers to prepare for the wounded arriving from the front. So even in, not as nurses, but in terms of their luxurious homes being dedicated to convalescent men. Women also fought as combatants in the First World War. So some of the world's first female doctors, scholars and scientists came from Russia. There's also a long appreciation in Russian culture of a strong female figure as well. So it wasn't such an alien concept as some of the other countries, which we'll talk about in a minute. Some of these young women disguised themselves as men. Some of them just kind of assumed a neutral gender and didn't look female or male and hoped people didn't ask questions. And some of them just outrightly, as women, tried to fight. And there's Colonel Tomalovsky, who has a number of daughters, and more than one of his daughters did this. And because their father was an officer, they got away with it and they went and fought. Working class women managed it as well, so women who didn't have someone to shoehorn them in. So there's a great story about one woman who works in a tailor shop in Moscow, and she's sitting there surrounded by material and fabric and equipment. So she makes herself a uniform, shaves her head, pretends to be a boy, and goes to fight in the war. And this is definitely in Eastern Europe, in the Balkans. This is not as rare as it is in terms of Britain and France. In Britain, a number of female doctors came forward and volunteered their services to the War Office. And essentially what they were told was, there, little lady, why don't you go home and knit like all the other ladies and we'll take care of the war business? And they basically said, absolutely not. And they ended up going east to Serbia, where Serbia were just grateful to have any medical professional and didn't care that they were women. So they ended up operating over there at first until the War Office finally got over themselves and accepted these women. And there ended up being a hospital called Endell Street in London, where it was almost entirely staffed by female doctors, nurses and professionals and surgeons. And they dealt with tens of thousands of cases, sometimes operating for hours and hours a day, dealing with wounded men coming from the front. We also have to look at children as well. One of the aspects I really like looking at is Boy Scouts. So scouting is a movement that's far and wide by 1914, and there's a number of different ways that Boy Scouts got involved in the war, especially in the opening weeks. So in the UK, it was at a distance. They're nowhere near the fighting. And sort of from the 5th of August, Aldershot has tens of thousands of reservists reporting for the army. They escorted men to and from their barracks, and yeah, there was a brigade that specifically used to go up and down to the men guarding the railway lines and delivered their breakfast every morning. In Belgium, tensions are obviously higher because you've been invaded by the enemy. And there's a number of Boy Scouts there that kind of operate this reign of terror on innocent civilians. And it happens because one newspaper reports that a Boy Scout has caught a spy. And from then on, it becomes a plague. Every single Boy Scout wants to find a spy and wants to make himself famous and end up in the papers. So you have them stalking innocent civilians. And there's this one brilliant story of this Boy Scout that had decided a man was a spy. And he's just this sort of portly gentleman who's out minding his own business and shopping. And he ends up being stalked, and they say Red Indian style, by this kid who follows him. And they said that they got him so flustered that he went into 3 separate shops in the space of 20 minutes to buy tobacco because he was just trying to shake his tail, basically. And it ends with this kid kind of screaming that he's a spy, and all of these people harassing this poor man who found himself about to be arrested and carted off, until one of the policemen came along and went, "No, I know him, he's not a spy, don't be ridiculous." So yeah, they were essentially little terrorists harassing the local population. So if we go even closer to the action in France and the city of Nancy, we have a unit, if you like, of Boy Scouts who are just bonkers. So they're a society of young gymnasts who've been put in uniform, and spontaneously they have offered to run dispatches. So they're on their bicycles going backwards and forwards from different army units, sort of night and day around the city, going at a high speed, dangerous speed, and annoying all of the locals, taking these messages towards the border and towards the fighting. And they also unofficially, because they happen to be going backwards and forwards, soldiers, don't forget, if your husband has gone off to war, at this point, you haven't had any mail from him. He's just disappeared 2 weeks ago and you have no idea what's going on. So you would have soldiers saying to them, "Can you just take a message back to my wife and tell her I'm okay, and tell her where I am, and tell her it's all right." So they were doing this. But then they start souveniring, which is grabbing any form of paraphernalia they can from the war, whether it be a German spiked helmet or some cap badges, and dealing them. They eventually, at the market hall in Nancy, are dealing all of this stuff. And because they're making money out of it, they're going more and more where they shouldn't be going. And so I haven't found the evidence for it, but this is a quote that says, "Accidents having occurred, young people have been killed or injured by their excesses or imprudence. The military authority prohibits their peregrinations." So I think they were put in their place and not allowed to do any of this anymore. One set of people that we hardly ever talk about when it comes to the war is the elderly as well. Just because you're too old to fight, it's a mistake to assume that the elderly did not participate in the war, or that they were disinterested in it. So after all, it's their grown-up children in the trenches, so they're very much invested in what's going on. There's a story of one Belgian woman in Brussels. So when the German army march into Brussels, which is essentially given up to the enemy because so many atrocities have occurred, and because Brussels has no strategic value, the Belgians pull out and tell people don't oppose the Germans coming in. But as they're marching into Brussels, everybody's it's raining, and everybody's just watching them silently, like malevolently staring at these German soldiers that they don't want there. And one woman breaks through the crowd, and she's pushing her way to the front, and she's screaming at them, "You killed my son, you've killed my son." And there's sort of this harrowing account of them trying to pull her away. But the Germans, to their credit, I think that many of them looked at her as they went past, but they didn't react to what she was saying. They left her to it. I think they understood that she had every right to be screaming. There's a writer called Ernest Hornung, and if you've ever read the books about Raffles, the gentleman thief, that's him. And he had a son, Oscar, who was killed in the war, and he was absolutely devastated. And the war carried on, and he didn't know what to do with himself. And so he decided he was going to go to France. And what he did was work for one of the YMCA stations. So he basically lived in a hole dug in a railway embankment, dishing out tea to soldiers who came past him. And it was the only way he could feel close to his son. He got as close as he possibly could to where he knew his son had died. And he basically stayed there and lived in squalor. And suffered for the entire war, and his health really suffered as well. But he wouldn't leave because it was the only way he could feel close to his dead son. But even if elderly people didn't go to those lengths, it didn't mean that they weren't invested in the war and trying to do their bit as well. So there are some photographs of when the war broke out in 1914, it was just as the harvest was due, and all of this stuff needed bringing in, because otherwise you're looking at imminent starvation. So what you had was very old people and very young people and women go out into the fields to do the harvest because the men had disappeared. Not only the men as well, but their animals, their draft horses had gone to the war. So people who you would never assume to be doing hours and hours of backbreaking labour were actually out in the fields. And also, there's another account in the city there's a journalist who wrote a book in Paris, and what he did was spend the first 2 weeks of the war, every day he would go out and just walk the streets of Paris and write down everything that he saw and describe the beginning of the war. And one of the things that happened in Paris as soon as the war broke out was that it got dirty really quickly because all the bin men had gone to war. So rubbish was piling up in the streets. And one day this journalist was out walking about and he saw a truck being driven by a teenager, but with another old man with him. And he stopped them and said, "Would you mind going to my street because it's really filthy?" And they said, "Oh, well, you need to ask the man in charge." And there's an elderly man following up behind. And so the journalist has a long conversation with him and he says, "Yes, of course." And as he said, he gets a notebook out of his pocket, and as he gets the notebook out, he sees that this man actually is wearing medals from the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. And he says, "Oh my God, you have the Legion of Honor." And he says, "Yeah," he says, "I'm too old now, but I have 2 sons that have gone to the war, and you just have to do what you can to be helpful." So that was the thing that he could do at that precise moment, was go and collect the rubbish. So that's what he was doing. In terms of people who aren't participating in the war but are very much affected by it, you have to talk about refugees, which number in the millions as soon as the war begins. And generally, the first people to run away, which is an absolutely natural response, are the ones living close to borders. So in East Prussia, stories of atrocities kind of spread that are carried out by the Russians, these people that were German by nationality, just legged it, basically. So by one estimation, a government official said that 870,000 people in East Prussia fled their homes in August 1914 alone, accounting that's a quarter of the population decided they were no longer safe and just put everything they could carry on the back of a car or on a bicycle or on their backs and fled. So you have the same to the southeast from there in Galicia as well. Once again, the advancing Russians, people are terrified. This is what we now think of as parts of Ukraine and southern Poland. It's called Galicia, and it's part of Austria-Hungary at the time. So those people decide that they're going to flee as well. So within 3 weeks of the outbreak of war, 100,000 refugees have gone through Lemberg, which is the main city there, alone. So by September 1914, they were already counting 350,000 refugees just in one half of the dual monarchy, and that number had doubled again by October. So Belgrade came under fire immediately, even before August started. It was the first city to come under fire. Had about 90,000 inhabitants at the beginning of the war in 1914. And the estimate is that within the first few weeks, 80,000 of them had run away. So all of these people are now roaming the countryside without food, without shelter, and without anywhere really definite to go as well. They're just trying to escape the fighting. This obviously puts people in danger. But other than the obvious dangers of being on the road without shelter and without any definitive destination in mind, you have to add blatant atrocities that were carried out against civilians in the first weeks of the First World War. It's especially prevalent in the opening weeks. As soon as the German army crossed the border in Belgium, they began executing civilians for various reasons. It becomes a kind of an epidemic, and there are a few reasons for it. Now, one of them is that the Germans are obsessed with the idea of the Front Terror. So this is a label they applied to civilians in the Franco-Prussian War who picked up a rifle and started shooting at them. So think about it. It's terrifying that just a bloke who's not a soldier would suddenly pull out a gun and begin shooting at you. So they begin obsessing about the fact that every civilian is one of these and every civilian is a danger to them. Then you factor in the fact that they're terrified, they don't know where they are, they're drunk as well. So one of the things that German soldiers did was loot alcohol as they were on the road. So there are different accounts from different French and Belgian villages of them rocking up in town, setting fire to buildings and then raiding the local bar and drinking everything in it, drinking someone's champagne supply and carrying on. So they're exhausted, they're drunk, they're terrified, and they've been conditioned to believe that civilians are a danger to them. And what it does is create this kind of perfect storm whereby they are ready and willing to open fire on innocent men, women, and even children as well. There's also accounts of them using civilians as human shields to advance against the enemy. So the vast majority of these atrocities are carried out as punishments, and the claim is that these civilians were participating in the war and therefore they were combatants. But so, for instance, in Dinant, which is the worst affected town in Belgium, where 674 civilians are killed, the eldest is in their 80s and the youngest one is a baby who's only a few weeks old. So at no point can you claim that that baby had opened fire on you. So far, we've looked at civilians who chose to run. I mean, maybe it was an inevitable choice if there are soldiers in front of you. But perhaps the most distasteful journeys were inflicted on people who had spent their lives in a country only to be labelled outcasts in 1914 by their own governments. I've just written a book called Ring of Fire, and we told the story of a lady named Elsa Khan who lived in Paris. So she had a British father, an Irish mother, she'd been raised in France, and she was married to an Austrian. So what country she was from was a really complicated idea for her. She said she felt like all of those places were home to her. But the French decided that she was a suspicious person, that she, her children and her husband and her father-in-law as well, who was very old, that they were at risk and that they could not remain in Paris because they may have a detrimental effect on the French war effort. So they were loaded into cattle trucks like animals, exactly like you'll see if you study the Holocaust in the Second World War. The French government opened a dozen detention camps, and they were sent to one in Normandy, first of all. Men were separated from women, just like during the Holocaust, put into the cattle wagons and travelled for days and days without any food or proper toilet breaks. And eventually they were moved as far south. They were moved all the way to the Spanish border and the Pyrenees. So they had their freedom taken away from them, and she would be interred as an undesirable with her children and her family until the end of the war. There's also the terrifying question of what they were going to go home to at the end of the war as well. So in mid-September 1914, her sister managed to send her one last care package where she packed up some bed sheets and some clothes, winter clothes, because obviously it was going to get colder, but warned that this is the last time she thinks she could get inside a house because the French government had taken the house and every penny that the family had in the bank as well and claimed it. Thank you for watching. In the next episode, we'll be putting the Western Front to one side and looking at the fact that this is actually only a tiny part of the First World War and examining some of the other places that saw fighting.